Addiction is not a disease. That's the first lie you've been told. A lie that softens the sharp edge of responsibility and buries you under the comforting illusion that you are helpless. But helplessness is a cage, and the keys to that cage were always in your hands. Think of Socrates speaking of akrasia, the weakness of will. He didn't excuse it as biology gone haywire. He called it ignorance, a blindness to what we truly value. Addiction is not fate. It's not a genetic curse. It's a learned pattern of reaching for the nearest fire when you feel cold, even though it burns you every time. Plato painted the human soul as a chariot pulled by two horses. One noble, disciplined, striving toward truth, the other wild, ravenous, pulling toward chaos. Addiction is when the wild horse takes the reins. But it doesn't own you. You let go of the ropes. Aristotle sharpened this further. Virtue is a habit, and so is vice. Addiction is not a permanent scar on the brain. It is the grooves of repeated action, strengthened by use, weakened by disuse. If habits can be built, they can be dismantled. Now look at the modern numbers. Nearly 48.5 million Americans wrestle with substance use disorders right now, yet 85% receive no treatment. You're told recovery is impossible without experts, clinics, 12-step confessions, and yet, shockingly, most people quit without any formal help at all. Opioid deaths remain at 50,000 each year, tragic and brutal, but here's the hidden fact. The vast majority who fall into addiction eventually climb out. Studies show 75% recover. Most need 5 or more serious attempts, but they make it. Addiction isn't a life sentence, it's a war of attrition. And Nietzsche would sneer at the language of victimhood we drape over this struggle. He would call addiction an abyss, and he would spit on those who gaze into it and say, "The abyss controls me." No, the abyss stares back to test you. The will to power, the ability to seize your life and carve it into form, that is your weapon. Quitting is not a clinical outcome. It is a heroic rebellion. It is saying, I refuse to be reduced to the weakest part of myself. But society profits from your chains. Rehab industries balloon, insurance empires feed on the narrative of incurability, and the 12-step model whispers dependence into your ear, teaching you to forever call yourself powerless. What if that's the most corrosive myth of all? What if powerlessness is the very drug you're still hooked on? Addiction is not a brain disease. It is a philosophy of surrender. And the way out is not treatment as usual. It's war. The war of reclaiming will, of forging identity in fire. The only question is, are you ready to fight? The ancients knew something modern science keeps fumbling with. Freedom is terrifying, but it is also absolute. Sartre declared that we are condemned to be free. Even in chains, even in the midst of craving, even in the pit of withdrawal, you still choose. To say I cannot stop is not a truth, but a refusal to own that unbearable freedom. Every drink, every pill, every needle, every click of the mouse on whatever digital poison you crave, it is a choice. To call it otherwise is to abdicate responsibility, to let the shadow of your own will masquerade as destiny. Freud, of course, would whisper that your unconscious drives are the puppeteers. That addiction is the return of repressed desire, the child inside you screaming for comfort against pain. But here's the raw reality. Even Freud's patients changed. They re-scripted their lives not by annihilating desire, but by confronting it. Jung pushed this further. The shadow you deny, the dark hungers, the cravings, the rage at yourself, is exactly what must be faced. Integrating the shadow is not about purity, it's about power. Addiction thrives when you run from it. But when you stare at it, unblinking, it loses its monstrous scale. This is where philosophy and psychology collide. Addiction is akrasia, weakness of will. Addiction is the shadow, unintegrated. Addiction is learned behavior, grooved pathways in the brain. And that means it is plastic, malleable, breakable. Mark Lewis, a neuroscientist who lived through his own addictions, dismantled the brain disease model. He showed that addiction is simply the brain's natural learning process hijacked by repetition. A bad habit burned into neural circuits, but like any learned skill, it can be unlearned. Hannah Pickard takes the same stance. Addicts are not broken machines. They are agents with reasons, however destructive. You didn't drink because a neuron fired. You drank because in that moment, you believed it solved something. Now think of the irony. The system tells you you're powerless, diseased, that only endless meetings and surrender to a higher power can save you. But statistics scream the opposite. Most people who recover do it outside formal programs. The machinery of recovery often prolongs dependence rather than freeing it. What if the 12 steps are not salvation but another leash, teaching you to call yourself an addict forever rather than declaring yourself free? The truth is sharper, harsher, but liberating. You are not sick, you are enslaved by a pattern. And enslavement demands not pity, but rebellion. You don't beg chains to loosen, you tear them off. The will to quit is not an accessory to treatment, it is the treatment. Every philosophy worth its salt teaches this. Mastery begins when excuses die. When the hand that reaches for the bottle pauses and says, no more. When the abyss demands your gaze and you stare into it until it blinks first. And here's the provocation. Maybe addiction is not your enemy at all, but your training ground. The harshest mentor you will ever face. The crucible that forces you to learn self-mastery, or else perish. Would you really call that a disease, or is it a summons to greatness? The language of recovery has been poisoned by comfort. You are told to manage cravings, to take it one day at a time, to accept powerlessness. But when did mediocrity ever liberate a soul? Epictetus, the crippled slave turned philosopher, said, no man is free who is not master of himself. Not one day at a time, not in cautious whispers. Mastery is total, or it is nothing. Imagine him staring at a trembling addict, shaking with withdrawal and saying, your suffering is not the bars of a cage, it is the raw material of freedom. If you can master this agony, nothing in life can touch you. And yet our culture does the opposite. It medicalizes everything. It teaches you to outsource willpower to pharmacology, to call craving a symptom, relapse a disease flare. But the numbers are undeniable. Most people walk away without medication, without inpatient programs, without the endless ritual of meetings. The real difference is not in the treatment, it's in the decision. Addiction is not a broken thermostat in the brain. It is a feedback loop of desire and relief, carved by repetition. The loop breaks when you say no, not when a therapist says you're sick. Aristotle knew habits are destiny. Character is forged by repetition. Addiction is repetition misaligned, practice gone feral. But here's the overlooked truth. Just as you trained yourself into slavery, you can train yourself into freedom. Neuroplasticity is not a buzzword, it's a weapon. Every time you resist, you weaken the old pathway, strengthen a new one. The will becomes a muscle, not by thinking, but by doing. Nietzsche would laugh at the culture of relapse statistics, the endless counting of days sober like beads on a rosary. He would call it slave morality, measuring yourself against failure, worshipping weakness. He'd demand something bolder, not abstinence as survival, but abstinence as affirmation. Not I quit because I must, but I quit because I will. Because I will not be ruled by what is lower in me, because my life is not a kennel for cravings. And here's the fact that should detonate in your mind. 75% of addicts eventually recover. 75. The myth is that only a chosen few make it out alive. The reality is the majority do. Yes, it takes repeated attempts. Yes, it hurts. But the statistical weight is not against you, it's for you. Recovery is not rare, it is the norm. What's rare is believing it. So why does the system insist on telling you otherwise? Because an addict who believes he is broken buys treatment forever. But a man who sees addiction as habit, not fate, that man becomes dangerous. Dangerous to the industry, dangerous to complacency, dangerous to every narrative that keeps you tame. The question is not, can you quit? The question is, will you keep believing the myths that make quitting harder than it really is? Addiction thrives on the myth of inevitability. The story whispered into your ear is this: once hooked, always hooked. You are told your brain has been rewired beyond repair, that you are forever branded with the scarlet letter of addict. But history, science, and lived experience tear this lie apart. The brain is not stone, it is clay. Neuroplasticity is constant, your circuits reshaping with every choice you make. The groove of craving was carved by repetition, but repetition can carve a different groove. Addiction is not destiny, it is momentum, and momentum can be stopped. Look at contingency management, the most effective overlooked intervention in modern psychology. NPR reported in 2024 that it doubles quit rates. Doubles. Not through mysterious pharmacology, not through surrender, but through the blunt reality of incentives. You make a choice, you get rewarded. A behavioral truth Aristotle would nod at: we do what is reinforced, and when reinforcement favors freedom, the habit crumbles. Addicts don't need mysticism. They need to remember they are trainable creatures, capable of steering themselves. Then there is mindfulness. The Thrive program showed it can rewire attention, teaching people to sit with craving instead of feeding it. Imagine Epictetus watching a modern addict breathe through withdrawal and smiling. There, that is mastery. To sit with the storm and not bow. The Stoics had no fMRI scanners, but they knew the mind could be trained to endure anything. And in 2025, the frontier is expanding. VR therapy, AI-powered recovery coaches, holistic programs from Henry Ford Health to SoCal Recovery, integrating body, mind, and meaning. The tools exist, the science advances, but the principle is eternal. You are not diseased. You are unmastered. Addiction is not incurable. It is unchallenged. Now consider Nietzsche again. The will to power is not about crushing others. It is about mastering oneself. Addiction strips that will, convinces you that craving is sovereign and you are subject. But in truth, every urge is a test, a duel. When you resist, you do not merely stay clean, you affirm life. You rise above the animal and declare, I am creator, not slave. I am author, not passenger. And here's the scandal nobody wants you to hear. Most people quit addiction without formal help. They don't pay clinics. They don't worship meetings. They simply reach a breaking point and walk away. Does that sound like disease, or does it sound like choice? The system calls that spontaneous remission. I call it proof. Proof that you are not broken. Proof that you are not powerless. Proof that you do not need permission to be free. So why keep playing the role of the patient when you could play the role of the rebel? Every culture tells its own story of chains. Some carve gods into those chains and call them fate. Some call them genetics or trauma or chemistry. But at the core, addiction is a cage we help build. And the most sinister part is that society sells you the cage as if it were medicine. Think about the billion-dollar rehab industry, clinics charging tens of thousands for 30 days of recycled slogans, pushing the dogma that you will always be sick, that you must always return, that relapse is inevitable. This is not healing. It is dependence repackaged as treatment. Freud once said civilization is built on renunciation of instinct. Addiction is the refusal of that renunciation, the surrender to the immediate hit, the shortcut to relief. But here's what Freud didn't fully grasp. The unconscious isn't a jailer, it's a reservoir. When you suppress your drives, they erupt sideways, but when you harness them, they fuel creation. The same impulse that fuels addiction, the hunger for intensity, the drive for relief, can be transmuted. You do not kill desire, you redirect it. You make it serve you. Jung's voice cuts deeper here. What you refuse to face in yourself becomes your master. The addict hides from the shadow, and in hiding gives it dominion. Integration means dragging that shadow into the light, saying, yes, I crave, yes, I want to escape, and I will not pretend otherwise, but I will wield that energy. This is not purity, this is alchemy, turning poison into strength. Look again at the numbers society hides. Most addicts recover, 75%. That is not the story of a chronic disease, that is the story of a temporary captivity. Yet the narrative of incurability persists because it feeds industries. It keeps you docile, grateful for crumbs of progress, forever declaring yourself in recovery. Nietzsche would laugh bitterly at this. He'd say it's the morality of slaves, defining yourself by chains instead of declaring yourself free. To him, true quitting is not mere abstinence, it is transfiguration. It is becoming stronger because you have wrestled with the abyss and survived. And the abyss, this is where the existentialists enter. Sartre would remind you that even in the pit, you are free, condemned to choose. That means every drink, every needle, every relapse is not destiny. It is decision. A hard truth, but one that slices through victimhood. Addiction is not a storm that batters you. It is a door you keep choosing to walk through. The freedom is terrifying, but it is yours. So ask yourself, do you still believe the story you've been told? That you are sick, powerless, fragile? Or are you willing to see addiction for what it really is? A trial by fire, a challenge issued to your will, a summons to become more than you have ever been. Addiction is the purest form of slavery, because the tyrant lives inside your own skin. No guard towers, no shackles, no overseer, just your own hand reaching again and again, for the thing that owns you. And yet, like every tyranny, it survives only as long as obedience continues. The first act of rebellion is recognition. I am not sick, I am not powerless, I am ruled by habit, and rulers can be overthrown. The Stoics taught that suffering is not in the thing itself, but in the judgment we attach to it. Craving is just sensation, a tightening in the chest, a restless itch in the mind. It screams, I will kill you if you don't feed me, but that's a lie. Epictetus would tell you, craving has no power unless you consent. Imagine sitting with the urge, watching it like a storm cloud pass overhead, refusing to kneel. That is not weakness, that is training. Every resisted urge is a sword sharpened. Psychology now confirms what philosophy always knew. Behavior is learned. Addiction is not a demon in the blood, it is a script rehearsed until automatic. And any script can be rewritten. Cognitive behavioral therapy strips it bare. Identify the trigger, dismantle the thought, act differently. Contingency management proves the same with brutal pragmatism. Reward new behavior, starve the old. This is not sorcery, it is discipline. But here's the revelation that should ignite rage. The very institutions that claim to heal often prolong the bondage. The 12-step model, for all its community, locks people into permanent identity as addicts. A scarlet word recited daily. Imagine Aristotle's horror, defining virtue as habit, yet teaching men to forever identify with vice. What if the first step is not admitting powerlessness, but declaring war on it? Nietzsche would say yes. He would demand you affirm not merely sobriety, but life itself. To quit not in the language of avoidance, but in the roar of creation. I quit because I will to live more, to live higher, to live fiercely. He would spit on the idea of counting days as if freedom were a prison sentence measured in calendar squares. Real freedom is when the thought of using disgusts you, not because you're afraid of relapse, but because it insults the greatness you are forging. And the numbers again expose the truth. 50,000 die each year from opioids. A tragedy, yes, but millions more recover quietly, outside the spotlight. Society focuses on the dead to sell you fear, but the invisible majority, the ones who quit, prove a deeper truth. Recovery is not rare, it is common. The only uncommon thing is believing in your own power to do it. So the battlefield is not out there in clinics or meetings, it is in here, in the raw silence of your will. The chains rattle, the abyss beckons, but the rebellion is yours to begin. The war against addiction is not fought in hospitals or church basements, it is fought in the architecture of your own choices. Sartre was right. You are condemned to be free. That is the terrifying burden and the exhilarating weapon. You may believe that craving is destiny, but every time you lift the bottle or light the pipe, it is not fate, it is consent. Addiction thrives on your denial of freedom, on the lie that you had no choice. But deep down, you know the truth, you always did. This is why the disease model is seductive. It absolves. If it's just chemistry, if it's just brain wires misfiring, then you're a patient, not a soldier. You wait for treatment, you wait for rescue. But here's the scandal. Most quitters never had treatment. They didn't wait for permission. They ripped the leash out of their own flesh. And that's the part the recovery industry doesn't want you to hear, because a self-liberated addict pays no bills. Jung saw this clearly. The shadow you refuse to own rules you in secret. Addiction is the shadow magnified, a part of yourself you exile but secretly serve. The way out is not denial, it is confrontation. To look the craving in the eye and say, yes, you are mine, but you do not command me. Integration, not exile. Power, not purity. This is why so many relapse. They try to amputate the shadow instead of mastering it. And then comes Nietzsche, the philosopher of fire. He would spit on recovery stories that sound like survival manuals. For him, quitting would not be about getting back to normal. It would be about transfiguration, about becoming stronger, more alive, more dangerous because of what you've overcome. What does not kill me makes me stronger is not a slogan for t-shirts. It is the battle cry of those who have crawled through craving and emerged steel. Imagine embracing abstinence not as deprivation but as defiance, as a creative act, as self-overcoming. Even the latest science affirms this. Mindfulness, VR therapies, AI-driven recovery apps, all tools pointing to the same truth. You are trainable, you can bend your brain, but you must be willing to fight, not coddle yourself. To use craving as resistance training, not as a justification for surrender. And here is the most radical twist. Addiction is not your curse, it is your calling. The abyss you've stared into is the forge. Most people live soft lives, never tested, never broken, never forced to master themselves. You have been thrown into fire. The question is not whether you can quit. The question is whether you will rise from this inferno as ash or as something untouchable. Think of the addict who quits not because a counselor told him to, not because a sponsor held his hand, but because one day he looked in the mirror and said enough. That moment is not medical. It is existential. It is the moment of Sartre's radical freedom, when you recognize that you are the author, not the victim of your life. The addiction was never an invader. It was always you. And because it is you, you can change it. This is why the myth of powerlessness is poison. To confess powerlessness is to etch weakness into your very identity. Aristotle would recoil, virtue is practice, strength is practice, and so is freedom. The addict who calls himself powerless every morning is training powerlessness like a muscle. No wonder relapse stalks those who worship fragility. The opposite is needed, a declaration of power, a refusal to bow. Not I am sick, but I am sovereign. Look at the hard data, stripped of sentiment. Nearly 75% of people with addictions recover eventually. 5 or more attempts, yes, but the majority succeed. Addiction is not a terminal illness, it is a stage. A brutal one, but a stage. The lie of incurability chains you more tightly than the substance itself, because if you believe you are destined to fail, you will never strike with the force needed to succeed. Nietzsche understood this abyss better than anyone. He said that to look long into it is to risk becoming it, but he also knew the abyss can be endured, and endured with style. To quit is not merely to refuse the drink or the drug. To quit is to laugh at the abyss. To say, I stared into you, and I chose life anyway. That is not survival, that is triumph. And here's where psychology and philosophy converge. Every craving is a chance to practice mastery. Every urge is resistance training for the soul. Contingency management shows us with blunt evidence. Reinforce the choice, and the choice strengthens. Mindfulness proves, watch the urge without feeding it, and the urge dissolves. This is not theory, it is practice. It is muscle. So why are you still told recovery is fragile? Why are you told you're always one step away from collapse? Because a society of self-mastered people cannot be controlled. But a society of patience can be shepherded forever. The real revolution is when you stop asking permission to be free. And freedom is not just abstinence. Freedom is when you no longer measure yourself by what you resist. Freedom is when the thought of going back is absurd, beneath you, an insult to what you've become. That is not recovery. That is rebirth. Quitting addiction once and for all is not about crawling back to some fragile version of who you were before. It is about burning that old self to ashes and stepping out as someone unrecognizable to the person who once obeyed cravings. Addiction is not an illness, it is a crucible. And the only way through a crucible is transformation. The numbers tell the story that the system hides. 75% recover. They stumble, they fall, they get back up, but they recover. Not because of endless meetings, not because of surrender, but because at some point they forged the will to stop. The Virginia Tech study of 2025 made it clear. Most succeed after 5 or more serious attempts. 5 battles, 5 retreats, and then the final war where they refuse to retreat again. That is not pathology, that is perseverance. Nietzsche would call this the will to power, the refusal to let weakness define you, the affirmation of life in its fiercest form. Sartre would call it radical freedom, the terrifying recognition that even in chains you always had the power to choose. Epictetus would call it self-mastery, the only true freedom worth having. Freud and Jung would call it integration, the turning of unconscious hunger and shadow into fuel for growth. Lewis and Pickard would call it learning, the brain's habits retrained, the pattern rewritten. Different vocabularies, same conclusion. Addiction is not a sentence, it is a struggle, and struggles are meant to be won. Society will tell you that you need to identify as an addict forever, but that is servitude disguised as humility. To define yourself by your weakest moment is to kneel before it for life. The stronger path is to say, I was addicted, but I am not now. I am not powerless. I am not fragile. I am sovereign. And here is the final truth. Quitting is not deprivation. It is conquest. Addiction is an empire of ashes, a false king demanding tribute. To stop is to revolt, to overthrow, to crown yourself as ruler of your own being. That is why relapse loses its power once you stop measuring yourself by it. The real end of addiction is when freedom feels natural, when slavery feels absurd. You are not a patient. You are not a victim. You are not sick. You are a warrior standing at the edge of the abyss, and you have stared long enough. The time has come to turn, to walk away, to live as though you were never chained at all. Because the way to quit addiction once and for all is not treatment, not surrender, not prayer. It is rebellion, it is mastery, it is freedom chosen again and again until the choosing becomes who you are.